Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Sasha Ramirez, the OECD Education and Skills Communications Manager. Really delighted to have you with us today. Today, the world seems to be speeding up. It seems to be getting more fragmented, more complicated, and it's really hard to imagine what education will look like tomorrow, let alone 5 years from now. Even I, who works in education, can't imagine what kind of world my kids are going to be going into when they enter the education space, or when they enter the workforce. I don't know how AI and technology are going to change the classroom, or how issues like global polarization, a changing international order, will affect how things like subjects like history or international relations are taught. And these things are notoriously hard to predict. Thomas Edison himself thought that books would become obsolete by the middle of the last century in the classroom. Fortunately, we have experts who are using strategic foresight to try to understand how global trends will affect the educational landscape. And this can have huge benefits, not only helping schools, education systems prepare for disruptions, but also to seize emerging opportunities like AI and to take actions today to shape the world of tomorrow. So I'm really pleased that we have a great panel of experts with us today who will help us shed light on the topic. With me are Sophie Howe, who's the Future Governance Advisor at the School of International Futures, and who is the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. We have Davina Marie, who's the Interdisciplinary Lead from Queen's College in London. Thomas Jorgensen, who's the Director for Policy Coordination and Foresight at the European University Association. And last, my colleague Deborah Nushi, who's a Senior Analyst at the OECD. Welcome, everyone. So, Deborah, I'd love to start with you to give us some introduction to the topic and to share the latest findings of our trends report. Over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. Hello, everyone. So I'd start us off by sharing some insights from the OECD's Trends Shaping Education project. This project is actually one of the most long-standing strands of work that we have in the OECD's Center for Educational Research and Innovation. It's been running for almost 20 years. But in recent years, we've seen increasing interest in this work and really a growing recognition among education leaders that structured thinking about the future is no longer an optional, nice to have, but it's really become essential for us if we want to ensure that education remains relevant in a world of rapid change. So why is there growing interest in futures thinking among education systems? Well, firstly, recent global shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic and the outbreak of war in Ukraine have really shown the need for education systems to prepare for the unexpected. One of the things that we hear from our country delegates is that these events have refocused attention on building resilience in education systems to ensure that they're better equipped for future crises, that they can better adapt and navigate future shocks that they may be facing. So these recent shocks may explain why we've seen a significant rise in the downloads of our reports since 2019. And also the fact that our most downloaded publication was a special edition that we published at the height of the coronavirus crisis. But beyond recent shocks, there's also a strong sense in general that the pace of change is accelerating, in particular in the area of technology. As you said, Sasha, a lot has happened in the world of artificial intelligence in recent years, and this is already changing deeply how we work and learn and interact with each other. So perhaps the bigger question is not simply about preparing for a specific shock or for using specific tools, but much more, how do we prepare for a world in which disruption is much more frequent and in which reinvention is really becoming a constant necessity. But finally, I also like to say that thinking about the future or long-term thinking is not simply about reacting to the latest trend or preparing for the next crisis, but it's also an opportunity to step back and to look at the bigger picture. So when we look at long-term data, it helps us understand underlying structural changes. It helps us cut through the noise of the latest thing that's on the media and rather to shift the focus on what is actually important versus what is urgent. And it can help us envision the futures that we want and to plan how we can actually get there. So what do we do at the OECD to support education stakeholders with this long-term thinking? We basically offer two approaches to think about the future. The main focus of our work is to provide robust, internationally comparable data on global megatrends outside of education. So we work with experts at the OECD who work across various sectors of society, and we look at long-term economic, social, technological, environmental trends. And this helps us identify societal shifts that might be relevant for education. And we complement this more quantitative work with a range of future thinking tools that are intended to help stakeholders anticipate potential developments that might be different from our expectations and that might be different from the trends that we currently see in the data. Unfortunately, there's no data about the future, so these future thinking tools are more explorative. They help us imagine what could happen if the trends accelerated, or if they break or bend, or interact in unexpected ways. So the sources of inspiration for this type of future thinking may come from many disciplines. For example, from history and social transformations in the past. It can come from literature, arts and design, cinema, other forms of storytelling. The golden thread of our work is its focus on education. So the main goal is to facilitate the use of data and the use of the tools in the education sector and to create those bridges. So we're interested in how the trends are shaping education systems, but also how education systems themselves can then actively shape the future and shape the trends that we will be seeing. The future thinking tools that we develop are grounded in a discipline called strategic foresight. Strategic foresight is a structured way of thinking about the future that is designed to help us make better decisions in the present. And it uses tools like horizon scanning, scenario building, and stress testing. These approaches are designed to help us question the implicit assumptions that we are all holding about the future, to explore a range of alternative possibilities, and this in turn can help us reframe the strategic choices that we can make. And also just a note about what strategic foresight is not. The aim is not to predict the future. We don't have a crystal ball. We're not trying to identify the one correct path towards the future, but instead it's a lot more around acknowledging uncertainty, helping us develop resilient strategies that can actually work across a range of scenarios, across a range of different futures. So to make all of this a little more concrete, I suggest that we dive into some of the insights from our latest report. The 25 edition of Trends Shaping Education was published in January this year, and it was developed together with my colleagues Jonathan James and Tali Malkin from the team. So in this edition, we offer an overview of 48 different trend indicators that are grouped under 4 main themes. And the chapters propose a narrative on trends that move from more global issues towards more personal issues. The first chapter offers an overview of international topics around global conflict and cooperation. Then we have a chapter on work in progress, where we zoom into economic and social concerns. The next chapter is called Voices and Storytelling, and here we delve into political and cultural trends. And the final chapter is focused on the very essence of what we are. It's called Bodies and Minds, and it looks into health and well-being issues. In addition to those main chapters, we also have some themes that we think are now embedded in all aspects of our lives. And so we did not want to look at them in isolation. These are the themes of technology, sustainability, and equality questions. So these topics are addressed in each and every chapter and are treated as more cross-cutting points. So unfortunately, I don't have the time to show you the 48 indicators. So I picked out one main indicator from each chapter. I'll tell you a little bit more about what else is in the chapter, and then we look into some of the questions that they raise for education. The chapter on conflict and cooperation begins by highlighting the rise in state-based armed conflicts that began around 2009. So that includes state-on-state conflicts like the war in Ukraine, but also conflicts between states and non-state actors, where at least one side is supported by a foreign government. And other indicators in this chapter highlight the far-reaching implications of a more conflicted world. This includes a rise in international migration, a slowdown in global trade, and also related concerns around energy security, implications for global cooperation on science, technology, and the green transition. In the chapter on work and progress, we zoom into economic and social issues, including the changing nature of work and the balance between work and other areas of life. So in this graph, you can see that people spend less and less time working and more time on other activities. And it also shows that this is especially the case among young people, where annual hours worked have decreased over time. In the chapter, we also have surveys around values and attitudes to work. And we see that they are changing, with some no longer seeing work as a core part of their identity, and many seeking greater flexibility, and also seeking greater sense of purpose and looking for more sustainable careers. The chapter, of course, also shows how global labor markets are transforming. For example, how the green transition is shaping labor markets, with employment in clean energy now already surpassing employment in the fossil fuel sectors. So while it is in some countries now, again, up to debate how much education should focus on sustainability, clearly in the labor market, these changes and the green transitioning is happening, and education systems must react to that. It also looks into the impact of AI and how the demand for AI skills is growing. In the next chapter on voices and storytelling, we look into issues of voice and representation, both in democracy, but also in the arts and online. Here you can see one of the issues addressed in the chapter is the steady decline in voter turnout since the 1960s. But other data in the chapter also shows that this doesn't mean that people necessarily care less about politics, but simply that they may be seeking other forms of expression, other forms to bring in their voices. So we see an increase of global protests, an increase in deliberative democratic processes, and also the explosion of different forms of expression and social organization online, with more individuals uploading content and participating in public debate online. And finally, the chapter on bodies and minds paints a diverse picture of progress and setbacks in the area of health and well-being. This graph here shows that mental health has risen to become a leading health concern across countries after the COVID-19 pandemic. Related to this, the chapter also has a focus on the changing nature of addictions, where we see that traditional addictions like smoking and alcoholism have gone down, but we see an increase in the use of synthetic drugs and in obsessive and compulsive use of social media, for example. So different types of addictive patterns. The chapter also explores the role that advances in medicine and technology, including artificial intelligence, can play in improving healthcare, supporting individuals with disabilities, for example. It also highlights how caring for others, however, remains an intrinsically human role and undertaking, but that the burden for caregiving remains quite unequally distributed across gender and other categories. So that was a bit of a whisk through some of the trends to give you a flavor of the broad scope that the report has on global developments. As I mentioned earlier, all the trend indicators are coupled with a set of questions that they raise for education systems. And the report covers all levels of education, from early childhood education and care through to higher education and lifelong learning. And it encourages readers to tailor questions to what is most relevant to their sector. So at the OECD, for example, we had a workshop where we used the report with our network of experts on early childhood education and care. And here in the sector, we might ask questions, for example, around how to nurture foundational skills like curiosity and adaptability at a young age in children to prepare them for an unknown future, or what kind of early participation opportunities can help, early democratic skills and help them understand their role in society. How educators can protect young children's well-being in a world where they're surrounded by connected devices, how they can protect their privacy. These types of questions then are tailored to different age groups. And of course, if you look at schools or technical education or higher education, the questions will be different. And the report also encourages to explore different areas of policy and practice. Many questions across all the chapters are around the future goals and function of education in a world that is changing so rapidly and suffering so many external pressures. A key question is typically in many areas around how schools can balance basic skills, teaching literacy, numeracy, scientific literacy, with more complex competencies like critical thinking and creativity, how schools can develop, or in higher education can develop, socio-emotional skills and civic skills that contribute to social cohesion, how we can develop the system thinking skills to actually understand complexity, address the sustainability challenges that we face. And with AI capabilities becoming ever more powerful, there's a question about where we want to put the focus for human learning. And since we spend less time interacting with other humans, more time communicating with machines, can education maintain a sense of community? Can it be the place where we foster belonging, well-being, have an open space for dialogue? But the chapters also raise questions for the organization of teachers and teaching. For example, we saw data about work becoming more flexible and there being more interest in flexible work among younger generations. So how can education address teachers' wish for greater work-life balance, for greater flexibility in their work? And what models of teacher professionalism can help them take risks and encourage them to try new approaches that take into account what we know from brain development, neurosciences, and so on. And there are many other questions on resources and structures, leadership and governance, equity and inclusion, research and innovation. Some of the questions are phrased in a deliberately kind of provocative way because the idea is to stimulate reflection and conversation about the trends and their implications. And then beyond those trends and questions, the report offers a range of future thinking tools. I would like to just share one of them, which is, I think, the most prominent tool in this report is a set of scenarios that we propose that offer an imagined future. They're not predictions, but they are different alternative ideas of how the future might look like. So in each chapter, we have a continuation scenario that assumes current trends would continue more or less in the same direction and at the same pace. A transformation scenario that assumes some transformative force has brought about significant changes, and a collapse scenario that imagines some kind of breakdown of dramatic magnitude, leading to a drastically different world. I show you the examples from just the global conflict and cooperation chapter. So here we have a continuation scenario that looks into how the world might look like in 2040 on the left-hand side and how education systems might look like. So here, for example, we see a future in which armed conflict persists, where we have mounting pressures on public spending. And so education is facing budget cuts. Research might be more confined to geopolitical blocks, influenced by military interests. Some institutions may become places of resistance. Educators may prioritize resilience and well-being, as many students are impacted by conflict directly or indirectly. And we have paired each of the scenarios with a fictional stakeholder story to make the scenarios more tangible and think about some of the consequences that different stakeholders may face. So here, for example, we imagine a university professor and how they might respond to heightened defense and security concerns and the implications it may have on student admissions for international students, for funding, for research focus, and so on. A second scenario imagines a world where we face radical globalization. So it is a world where we imagine that the measures to address climate change and the decline in global trade have led to a localization of production and consumptions. So we imagine communities who are growing their own food, are managing decentralized energy systems, and where life has become a lot more localized. But at the same time, there are thriving global connections where transnational communities form online, but physical traveling would be rare. And in this context, education might be focused on meeting local needs, playing a key role in supporting communities, focusing on core skills like engineering, agriculture. And education might operate in local community hubs where they are connected to local businesses, local service providers, bring in different generations. And tertiary education might be staying connected to global resources, sharing innovations and knowledge. And here we imagine how this might play out for a student who is quite happy with the local offer, but concerned about the fact that they would need a permit to go to a different area to study because travel is so rare. And the final scenario imagines a future where we've crossed multiple climate tipping points. So we have climate disasters, feeding armed conflicts, backing waves of migration. And we have here the story of an early childhood director describing how she's dealing with the dramatic consequences. So again, none of these are predictions. They're designed as thinking tools to inspire reflection. And and we encourage the stakeholders to play freely with the scenarios that are being proposed here. So on this slide, stakeholders are invited to identify which elements they see as most probable, most desirable, and least desirable. And what happens when we use those in workshops would be that stakeholders will judge the elements in different ways. So my preferred future is not necessarily your preferred future. And what I see as promising, you may see as threatening or the other way around. And this diversity of perspective is intended and desirable for the conversation. So it helps us bring out differences out in the open, and it's a first step to actually understand the complexities of how the trends may play out for different groups, different stakeholders. And the report invites users to create their own scenarios, because the most meaningful foresight will happen when institutions construct their own visions and see it as a process and not just an intellectual exercise. So it's a way of shaping agency. And I would like to conclude with that idea that the future is something that can only be constructed collectively, that we need collective expertise, shared narratives, and different perspectives to make it meaningful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. It's a really fascinating report, and that was a great overview, quick overview of it. I know there's a lot in there, so really encourage anyone online to check that report out. I think we're sharing the link in the chat if you haven't seen it. So I see hundreds of people from many, many countries all around the world who've joined us today. Welcome, everyone. And we're going to hear now from our experts, and we're going to get a good sense of how institutions, how governments are actually doing a strategic foresight, trends thinking in institutions to help them plan for the future. But I encourage any of you who are actually doing that in your own workplaces or your own lives to post that in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. So Davina, if I may, I'd love to start with you. I know you're the interdisciplinary lead at a big secondary school in London. So tell us what that means. Tell us how you're using trends and other work of a similar nature in your work to help you prepare for the future.
Thank you. It's great to be here with everybody. The need for interdisciplinary learning sort of came about as of about a year or so ago when we started to look at our provision specifically for the 14 to 16-year-olds, what we call Key Stage 4 in the UK, conscious of broader pockets of disenfranchisement with the current provision. We do a suite of GCSEs, which are very, knowledge-based 2-year courses that culminate in a grueling range of exams, and looking at what might be more appropriate, listening to voices from universities, listening to voices from industry, and thinking about future proofing for our students. And in the UK, schools, state and private schools, do have perhaps more freedom to consider school-directed learning than perhaps other countries. So with that in mind, we started a review, and we're looking at introducing an alternative course, Key Stage 4 initially, but as part of a broader review of our academic provision across the college. So starting 14 to 16, but then looking 11 to 18, and identifying the need for interdisciplinary learning in a way that would get our students ready to solve the problems of tomorrow, to be ready for future study, employability, but also to be useful, important agents in the world of tomorrow. So it's been an interesting journey, and we are, as a school, research-led. We like to be evidence-led, which has led to conversations with other experts, with other schools, in particular the Schools Directed Courses Consortium, and a group of schools doing different interdisciplinary and disciplinary courses across the country, and leading us to research and reports such as the Trends in Education report, which has been a really important part of our discussions in terms of creating the course. So a team of us are writing the course at the moment, and the publication has been really invaluable to us, imagining the future and considering what we would want our students to be ready to tackle in terms of real world problems. And this is an idea that has been important to us at the London Interdisciplinary School up the road. That is a new university where they tackle real world problems across disciplines, and the prevalence of interdisciplinary learning now at universities as well led us to really believe that this was an important part of what we could be doing at school level. And in terms of finding the content for the course, this report has been invaluable. It's very accessible for a teacher, but also, and really visually clear and the messaging is very clear. So on a sort of micro level, I've been referring to the report to develop the content of the course. So if you want a very micro example of how I've used the report, for example, I think, in terms of the topics, so I've looked at using global health and inequality, science, collaboration, innovation, fake news, diverse voices, gender, sustainability, all of these topics. It's sort of like a tick list for me in terms of looking at the case studies that we're including. And on a very micro level, for example, using an example of machine learning in the context of predicting a dengue outbreak in Brazil, for example, is an example that ticks the boxes according to the trends, but has led to a conversation with our computer science lead about where machine learning appears on his course, and as a direct result, we're adapting the computer science scheme of work so that they are able to tackle the topic of machine learning when they get to this part of the course, for example, on our interdisciplinary course. So that's a micro example of how your report is having an impact in our school.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Davina. Really interesting. Just to ask a quick follow-up, we've had a couple of comments from the chat, people talking about how inclusion is really critical to these kind of exercises. So I wonder when you're considering course design, how are you able, or how do you try to bring in some of the voices of students or other groups who may be historically marginalized or excluded into those kind of conversations and into that design?
Yes, well, that's an important part, I think, in terms of ownership and motivation, but also really valuable to include them in that process. So we've already started the pupil voice with the cohort, who will be our first cohort to go through. And it's been interesting to hear their feedback, not only about the design of the course, but also the structure and how it's going to be assessed. When we're talking about alternative assessments that are more fit for purpose, that's something that would, alarm them perhaps. So bringing them on that journey is really important. At Queen's, we do back to school sessions as well for the parents. So that might be on the theme of resilience, for example, and bringing in parents for a back to school session. And we will be doing a back to school session as well with them on this course, and bringing in some experts as well for them to hear from as well. So yes, pupil voice, meetings with parents where they get some of the insight into the thinking behind it have been an important part so far.
Really interesting. Thanks. As a parent myself, I can attest to the importance of bringing in the parents as well. So that's fascinating. Thanks so much, Thomas. I want to turn to you now. Let's look at the university level. I know at the European University Association, some of your work includes foresight. So walk us through that. Introduce us to what you do there and how foresight tools have helped higher education institutions prepare for the future.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. I mean, I love speaking about these issues, but just to begin with, who we are as an association, it's very easy. We are the Association of European Universities, 900 members across the whole continent, and we deal with university leaders. So it's a little bit different from what Davina is, much more on the coal face, and we're more dealing with the leaders and their institutional strategies and how foresight can help them. And I would say, as an institution or as an association, we deal maybe 30% with policy advocacy, policy development, where it's, of course, it's a hugely beneficial tool also internally, just to understand your preferred future, what it is that you actually want, which is not trivial at all. And then with leaders, either to introduce them to some of these tools or to think about very concrete things with using foresight. And we did one report, which I think it was at least fun to write. I don't know, I suppose I hope it's nice to read as well on the future of transnational education, where we use some of the same uh, techniques for scenarios that Deborah, you mentioned in your presentation. Um, and we also did things on AI, where we get people together in a room around a Miro board and think about the future. Um, I think if you ask sort of who do we get around that board, we're very much looking for people with commitment. I think that's one of the things when you work at leadership level, and maybe also in an academic setting. Um, we're very used to have sort of now I speak and you listen, and I'm the listener and you're the speaker, and have that commitment where you say, I want to. I think I'll talk more about that later, but I want to put myself at risk and say something that's wrong. You need to get that out. And one thing that I think is extremely important in this, when is both for the institutional development, but also for the policy development, is to really have the intention with these tools to think in new ways. Because there is this tendency in policy work, if you work in higher education, we all know what we think is right. We all know sort of the discourses out there, and there's a tendency we all come to meetings and we have that sort of pre-packaged in our head. Whereas these methods, often combined with other methods, we use things, if people are familiar with the ULab or presencing, um, those kinds of ideas where you really look for also involve the body, and so you will get new things out if you do things in sort of not only with the head but also with the heart and the hand as it is. Um, so the way in the years we worked with this, we're integrating it more and more uh, with that intention. I think that's important, with that intention to create something that breaks the discourses, because as you said, Sasha, the world is moving very fast, and if we just are stuck in our already packaged discourse, we it becomes anachronistic at some point. Um, yeah, so I just want to end up with a sort of praise for the OECD report as well. I think it was very good. I think if I can compare it to what we do, because of course we don't have that, let's say, analytical power as OECD has, that what I think is really excellent is that deep evidence base that we saw also from Deborah's slides, that you can really have that trend analysis. And where if you're an association like us that's much smaller, you much more go on, it's the collective effort and collective wisdom of the people in the room in the moment that sort of creates that window to the future. And I think it's really helpful to have that evidence base on the side, which we normally can't do ourselves. Um, but I'll end it here, and I'm happy to go into the details later.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Really fascinating. I love especially these elements of putting people outside of their comfort zone a little bit, making them reflect on their prejudices and their preconceptions, and that is a useful tool to kind of helping them reshape their thinking. So really fascinating. Just one very quick follow-up from my side, if we just very briefly, do you see, I mean, when you're working with leaders, do you see what kind of trends do you see? I mean, do you see more people becoming interested in this as a subject, as an exercise, or how are people's engagement changing?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we had a whole podcast series, and I suppose, you'll come put some of these things in the chat as well if they're not already there. We had a whole podcast series on examples of how universities are integrating this. Of course,
Mhm.
it's an investment. So it's universities that sort of have professionalized leadership, that have the money to say, okay, we'll hire somebody who knows how to do this.
Mhm.
Um, but as I heard in another context, people are yearning for meaning in this. They will go to anything that can take them out of a way of thinking that everybody agrees is not fit for the times we live in. So I think this really hits a very dry spot that way.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Sophie, let's turn to you next. You have the very fascinating title of you were previously called the First Minister of the Unborn. So I've never heard of that before, but it's a really interesting title in your role as the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. So talk us through that. Explain to us what that means and what kind of work you did to encourage long-term thinking in the education sector.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be with you. In 2015, Wales became the first country in the world to legislate to protect the interests of future generations. We passed a law called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which does a number of things. So, first of all, it sets out a statutory duty which is placed on all of our main public institutions. So, from our government right down to our municipalities, our local authorities, and all of the main institutions in between, to demonstrate how, when they're taking decisions, they're seeking to meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals. And this is basically a kind of a vision for Wales, a long-term vision for Wales. And it was devised in conversation with citizens, where we pose the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? So citizens sort of created or co-produced with government that vision. And the duties in the legislation then require the government and all of our institutions to test effectively all of the things that they do against whether it's going to help or hinder achieving that vision. And also through 5 principles for decision making. And those principles are considering the long-term impact of the things that you do and how things will play out for future generations, preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse, integrating our actions and our approach to policy. So recognizing that everything's connected to everything. If we don't, anticipate the sorts of things that we might need to be equipping our children with in the education system, not just to get the types of jobs that we might anticipate coming in the future, but to have a life well lived, to improve their physical and mental health and so on, then we're not going to have a thriving society in the future. Collaboration, so a requirement on all of those public entities to work together, so everyone getting outside of their silos. And then the principle of involvement, so requiring public bodies to involve citizens in the decision-making process. So in terms of, and then my job was to be the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. So I had statutory powers to both advise and support the government and other public institutions on how they meet the requirements of that legislation, and to monitor and assess the progress that they were making, and to intervene in decisions where I felt those things weren't happening. In terms of how that's played out in the education system, it's contributed to some significant reforms of our school curriculum in Wales, very much in line with some of what the other speakers have been talking about, particularly in terms of it being interdisciplinary. So looking to the future as best we can, and trying to assess what are the sorts of skills and capabilities that young people will need, as I said, not just to get the potential jobs, and we don't know exactly what those jobs will be, but actually to make sure that they are able to thrive in life as well. So the curriculum is based around 4 principles to create ambitious and capable learners. And this is really docked back to identifying that, a love of learning and lifelong learning with the rapidly changing world that we are living in will need to become the new normal. So the worst thing an education system can do is to knock out of a young person a love of learning. We really need to sort of embed that. Enterprising and creative contributors. So this is really, again, trying to develop this entrepreneurial spirit, but also recognizing the importance now, and particularly in the future when we're working alongside robots, AI, and so on, of those human skills around creativity. Again, we're seeing those things becoming increasingly important. Healthy and confident individuals. So this is really, again, focusing on the physical and mental health of our children, young people, being a key component of what a school system should deliver. And there's a whole range of different things that are happening in schools around that. And then finally, possibly my favourite one, ethical and informed citizens of Wales and the world. So this is really trying to capture this. I suppose what Deborah was saying around how can the education system itself help to actively shape trends in the future and create the sorts of citizens that perhaps in my generation and all our generations have been through an education system which equipped us to be ethical, and informed global citizens. Maybe we might not have a climate crisis or the polarization or the breakdown of trust in institutions and so on. So in terms of how those principles are delivered, all of the areas for learning, history, math, science, and so on, all have to be delivered through the lens of meeting those pillars in the curriculum, and they're very much done in a interdisciplinary way. So I can give you an example of Ysgol Bro Dynefwr, who have an approach in terms of outdoor learning. They're doing hydroponic gardening. They're integrating science, tech, environmental management into that. They are working then with a local farm around how their food for their school meals are coming and assessing, using data analysis, the carbon impact of that. When you were talking, Deborah, about the localization, I very much thought about actually that's the scenario that is kind of playing out in that example. The other thing, in terms of my role as commissioner, I informed the development of the curriculum and so on, but remain concerned that at age 14, this brilliant work that is starting to be rolled out in the curriculum, and it's been quite a long process. Last year was the first year that it was rolled out to all age groups, up to age 16. But effectively, when we get to age 14 and young people are going into the exam season, if you like, or the two is beyond a season, it's a 2-year GCSE process. I'm concerned that a lot of that falls off a cliff because we are still teaching to the test. And I really loved what Davina's put in the chat around us, around the work that you're doing to try to move beyond that. So some of my interventions, fairly radical, calling for the abolition of GCSEs, actually. That's quite challenging when you're operating in we're a small country operating in a global environment. It's challenging because, how do you assess with your peers in different countries and so on. I think some of the things in terms of the focus of PISA, for example, I'd like to see that developed further in terms of going beyond just, maths and literacy and science and so on, and looking at these softer skills as being not just an optional part of that, but being a really kind of critical mainstream part of those assessments. What we have, however, seen as a result of these challenges is we have seen a shift away from purely exam-based testing towards more course-based assessment and a range of other things. And I think there's still a remaining challenge for the system here in terms of, is the system still based on exams because that works for the system? That's what we can measure. That's the kind of easy thing to do in a way. And are we maintaining it for that purpose? Or actually, should we be reforming that so that it's more suited to the types of things that we want to be developing in our children, young people? Cooperation and collaboration, empathy, critical, assessment of information and all of those sorts of things. And I don't think those are the sorts of things that you can adequately test in a 2-hour exam on paper.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. And I think these talking about these pressures, the pressures that all systems are facing between something like, futures thinking, which is actually quite forward looking on the part of Wales to actually have that and invest in that. Politicians are up against short-term priorities and, of course, the election cycles and things like that. So actually, it takes a lot of will and a lot of courage to do that. We did have a comment from the audience. Somebody's Roisin McLaughlin's asking, is there some way we can actually get this information? Is there a model or a framework of this act that other governments could use? And if so, it'd be great if you could post that in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. And just to put this in a more global context, so building on the work that we've done in Wales, there's been a huge amount of interest because it's a world first. I've been doing a lot of advocacy work with many other people around how can we elevate this to a UN system and also see adoption in other countries. Last year, the UN passed the world's first declaration on future generations, heavily drawn from the work that we've done in Wales. And there are now approaching about 80 countries who they haven't, some are working on legislation. No one has tipped into actually passing the legislation yet, but there's lots of work going on. So there's legislation being in the Australian Parliament, in the Irish Parliament, there's a legislation in the Scottish Parliament, there's movements building in Norway, in Denmark, in Spain, Portugal. The Kenyan Senate is establishing a Senate Committee of the Future. So this is not just about education, although clearly education is a critical part of this. This is about how all of our systems of governance are thinking to the long term and thinking around how the decisions we take today will play out for future generations.
Fantastic. So some real momentum there. Davina, I see you nodding along with what Sophie is saying. So I want to bring you back in. If you can maybe reflect on some of those issues, how do you, when you're coming up against resource constraints, other priorities and things, how are you able to kind of convince people of the need for that kind of long-term perspective and of the value?
I think finding the time is difficult, of course, but making sure that there is some time is really helpful, and doubling up wherever possible, so that, for example, in our context where we're busy teachers, making sure that perhaps teachers' own professional development, for example, is being enhanced by stages in the long-term planning for the future. For example, in this context, we are a sort of research-led school. We've got the research Action Plus from the Chartered Institute of Teaching, and the idea there is that everything we do is research led. So we do action research, and it can be on a very small scale, for example, focusing on oracy, for example, in small groups, and doing small amounts of action research which might lead to something bigger, and making sure that all those sort of that professional development, or that short-term enhancement of our provision perhaps as part of a bigger picture. So I think when you can double up, that really helps, and it also makes people, encourages sort of motivation and participation as well. For example, that might be something to do, and also making for example, getting in experts to talk at the beginning of a process so that people feel really excited about it, and you can kind of bring people along, and using small working parties as well, and committees that can sort of don't have to double up and use up people's precious time. So different committees can specialize in areas that they're interested in, for example. So yeah, pooling people's special interests and expertise, and having a sort of a structured process along the way, so people don't feel that they are losing out on time or a short-term gain, for example, perhaps.
Of that economies of scale, and finding ways to make the process, kind of efficient and lower transaction costs is a great way to demonstrate the kind of the value there. So that's excellent. Thomas, I want to bring you back in on this issue as well. What's your take on, in terms of, how to engage with stakeholders, experts, others who may have other immediate priorities? How do we kind of create that space for forward-looking thinking that we need?
Yeah, I just want to say one key word about the long term, short term. I think that's agency. If you start to say this process will give you agency because it will make you more comfortable with the future, that's where you sort of you get the investment, and you get the relevance. For stakeholders, I think you need to bring in some of skills that come from the outside, in the sense not from futures thinking, in the sense of particularly active listening. You know, take time with your contacts in the stakeholders. Maybe go for a walk even, and say, try to listen actively to where they are and what their needs are, and then at the end, sort of to finalize, if they haven't said it, ask them about where do you see yourself and your organization in 5 to 10 years. And in my experience, you get surprised, because that's where you really get an understanding of, okay, this is where they are, this is their worldview and the narrative they live in. And that's where you can get them in and find that common ground. Um, but that's of course in my world, which is very much a policy leadership world. But I imagine that works as well if you're much closer to sort of the education phase.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Really interesting. Sophie, very quickly, because we're almost out of time, we're not doing very well on timekeeping, 9 minutes left. You mentioned when you were speaking that you had a public consultation. You asked people in Wales about their vision for the future. Walk us through very quickly how that worked. I mean, what kind of methods, techniques did you use? Maybe building on what Thomas said about this issue of asking the questions, but also building agency. How did that work?
Yes, so the government sponsored but didn't convene this national conversation, so they resourced it. It was run by a sort of neutral civil society organisation who ran it on the basis of, I suppose, what we described as a hub and spoke model. So they held it. They recruited hundreds of future generations champions across Wales, who then convened their own conversations, either geographically. So the Wales We Want went down to the Llanelli We Want in a kind of community consultation. And then we had things like the Young Farmers Associations holding conversations amongst their membership groups. We worked with schools. So as part of, learning the curriculum, we had school children writing letters to their future selves, which all came back up into the centre and was sort of analysed. We had schools working on Minecraft, versions of their ideal future Wales or future community, and so on. And I think the really interesting thing about that conversation is, number one, governments very rarely have conversations like that, quite open conversations around, what do you want the future to be? It's usually we're asking people about, do you like this policy or that policy or not? Also to think about things holistically, and to give people the space to sort of really come back to a sense of values. So what is it that's important? And there were some really interesting things that were coming out of that. So people were saying, and I can see someone in the chat talking about the Welsh language. People clearly said, we want to be able to pass on our language, our culture, and our heritage to future generations. So Welsh was a dying language. It's now the fastest growing minority language in the world, and Welsh is taught in across all age groups in school up until age 16. People talked about creating a more equal Wales. So no matter what your background, you should have these sort of equal chances, and that's being reflected in the curriculum. For example, Black history is a mandatory part of the Welsh curriculum as well. Those things around ensuring that the way in which we consider our economy, and often, economy takes priority above everything else. And, I think that's also why a lot of the conversations about the education system are always dominated by how do we ensure kids are getting the jobs of the future. Yes, that may well be important, but actually it's also about how do we have a life well lived, and how do we make sure that they're educated in a way, or they're being equipped with the skills to enable them to be ethical and informed global citizens. So that conversation was really powerful because it's a citizen set vision which spans beyond electoral cycles, and which politicians are held to account in terms of how their decisions are stacking up to achieve that. And I think also in terms of the really polarized society that we operate in today, actually open up those conversations about the future is a way of getting beyond that polarization, because there's a remarkable amount of agreement of people saying that in the future we do want clean air, we do want a planet to live on, and so on. So I would advocate it to any of you to try and progress those conversations in your countries.
Wonderful. I love especially the aspect of having champions from the community who look like the community, who represent the community, because that's really important to getting people to buy in and to understand, the issues that people are facing. Wonderful. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question about AI, because I think about a third of the hundreds of questions that we got in the chat are about AI. So can I ask maybe Thomas very quickly, is AI a game changer here? Are there in the conversations that you're having with your stakeholders, are people asking more and more about how AI is going to affect foresight, but also affect the world in which we live? How can strategic foresight help us engage in those conversations?
Yeah, I think this is a very typical sort of futurist exercise because there are several futures of AI, and I think we're being sold a narrative that says this is always going to work and this is always going to be better, and it's going to be sort of encroach more and more on our lives. And that's not the only future that's out there. I mean, you need to think through that future, but you do also need to think about, for instance, I've been in exercises where you say, well, a world where AI is a luxury. It's too expensive to have good AI. It's very difficult to have good AI. This is your luxury model. Or the other way around. There's a lot of AI out there, but human interaction is your luxury. And this is sort of the elite education is human interaction. The less AI, the better it is. And then, of course, there's the future of a model collapse where AI just gets worse and worse and worse. And at least at the end, we don't want to use it anymore, and it discredits the whole education effort. So I think where we are now, don't buy the one future discourse. I think that's really, really important. Think about all the futures and then think about, as I said before, which future do you want to move towards and what can I do today to do that? And there are good tools to do that. So you have that agency of where you go with AI and not AI go with you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Thomas. Davina, I want to give you just the last word here. Just building on what Thomas said, AI is one of the issues, but of course, we do need to prepare students for an increasingly uncertain future. There must be some apprehension on their part, I imagine, as there is on all of ours. So, how can we make them kind of future ready? How can we help ease them into this sort of thinking in such a way that doesn't just hold one worldview as the likely one, as Thomas said, but actually gives space for all sorts of different possibilities?
That's right. Well, well-being is an important part of that, and teaching them to be resilient and to thrive is really important. Especially, we've seen the increased anxiety and mental health issues, and part of that is as a result, perhaps, of some uncertainty. So that's an important part of it, and getting them to be ready, I think, to solve real problems, and that's where the interdisciplinary work hopefully will help with that. So looking at the real world problems and thinking instead of subjects in separation, but thinking about the world and instead as a series of complex issues which we have to navigate, and how can we do that and how can we be successful with that? Hopefully, the agents of their future, hopefully to use some of the language from today, is really important, and being aware that AI will be some part of their future, but absolutely just drawing on what Thomas was saying there about AI, questioning the sustainability as well, in the context, environmental sustainability of AI. We must all be questioning that for our future generations, I think, and not jumping in too quickly at this point. The sort of short term, this is quite short termist atmosphere around AI at the moment, which I'm sure we could all do well to take a step back from.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Davina. Well, absolutely. The future has not yet been written, so we will help to shape it ourselves. So we're almost out of time. I'm afraid we didn't get to all the questions that I wanted to. I also wanted to bring back Deborah. Apologies. We didn't have time for some further reflections from you. I think we probably could have all spoken for another 3 hours. But in the meantime, I encourage you to check out all of our profiles online, to follow all of our work. I know we've posted quite a few links in the chat, and please do, of course, tune in to future webinars. So huge thanks to all of our panelists who joined us today. Thanks to my colleagues for organizing this, and we'll see you all very soon. Thanks again.